I want to talk for a few minutes about why I think the study of church history matters. Now, if you're taking this course, then perhaps I don't need to try to convince you that church history matters, but I want to share with you a couple of my thoughts about why I think church history matters. It's, as a church historian, obviously it's what I've dedicated my life to doing, but I think there's some very practical applications of church history for Christians today and really for everyone today to understand more about our history. From my perspective, if we don't understand our history, we really don't understand who we are. We don't understand where we fit in the world if we don't know where we've come from. So I'd like to offer you a few thoughts on why I think church history matters, with a few examples to try to illustrate some of these points. First of all, I think church history matters because history often repeats itself. I am an historian who thinks that, not that everything is exactly as it was, but that things tend to go in cycles. That the writer of Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that comes has already been. And as an historian, we can often look and see these patterns. So, for example, one of the questions that we'll be looking at in this course is a debate within Christianity over who is a real Christian. Who has the right to say, I'm truly a Christian? This was an issue in particular with the Donatist controversy that we'll talk about in the 4th century, where two different groups were both claiming to be the legitimate Christians. And there was a violent dispute among them about who had the right to claim the name. And some authors even say they claim to be Christians, but they aren't really Christians. And how do we figure that out? How have Christians figured that out in the past? And what can we learn from the way that other Christians have dealt with this particular issue? Another example of how history repeats itself are things like new theories about Jesus, or new theories about Christianity, or you see on television a new document changes the entire history of Christianity. Well, usually these new discoveries are very old discoveries that we've already known about, but someone is reproducing them in a new way to try to cause scandal or to upset people. Just this morning, I was out at the monastery of St. Paul, out on the Red Sea, talking with a few of the students, the monks there, about Jesus theories that they hear about. Are these new? No, these are old. Some of the stories you hear in the modern media, we were talking about how these stories come from the 2nd century or the 3rd century or the 4th century, and they keep coming back again and again. And if we as Christians don't know about our history, then when something happens that the news media says is new, we could be thrown off by this. I know personally Christians who are bothered by some of these television shows. They will say, why did no one ever tell me about the Gospel of Thomas? The Gospel of Thomas, isn't that the real Jesus? And I have to explain to them, there are reasons that no one's told you about the Gospel of Thomas. But if we don't know about our history, then the new things that come along can throw us or can confuse us. Another example, Christians often make the same mistakes again. So one example, how do we treat other kinds of Christians? And this is obviously related to point number 1, with history repeating itself. How do we treat other kinds of Christians? Within Christian history, we can't ignore the fact that there has been a lot of controversy. And there have been times when Christians have decided that they needed to separate from each other, or there was some kind of conflict. In the midst of this, how do we treat each other? How do we as Christians treat each other? And how have Christians in the past treated each other? The Donatist controversy certainly fits here. There are things happening in the time of Augustine that would also fit in this category. How can we avoid making the same mistakes? How can we say the church has dealt with this in the past and we can learn from them? Now, there's a saying that we stand on the shoulders of giants, that we're not starting from the ground floor, that people have built up a great tradition and we stand on top of all the work that they've done. Well, that's great. It's wonderful. We do. We learn about the scriptures because wise men and women from the past have helped us understand the Scriptures. But also, let's learn from their lives. Let's learn from the things that they experienced. How can they help us deal with our own context today? Another reason is that the church is still struggling with its relation to the world. The church is still struggling with this issue. If you read the New Testament, it's very clear that one of the issues, one of the challenges for early Christians was, how do we interact with the outside world? Do we pray for our leaders? Are we favorable toward them? Do we think that they are put in place by God, so we need to honor them? Or do we fear our leaders? How exactly do we react to the world, to those who are outside the church? Not just the government, but certainly including the government. In the early church, persecution put this question at the front of the minds of Christians. How do we deal with the world when the world is, in some cases, literally killing us? How do we show the love of Jesus to a world in which mobs come and burn down our churches and kill us? How do we do that? It's one thing to sit back and say, yes, we love those people. When they begin killing you, it becomes more complicated. In the church today, different parts of the world, there are issues that people face. Sometimes very active persecution of the church. How do we respond to that? I live in the United States, and I think many American Christians, I think they don't have an understanding of the persecution that many Christians face in other parts of the world. So some Christians in America feel persecuted because we don't have Christian prayer in our public schools, and which they used to have Christian prayer in public schools. Now, would our culture be better if we had Christian prayer in public schools? Perhaps. But not having prayer in schools is not equal to being in a place where literally your life is at risk for being a Christian. Because there are still many places in the world today where your life is at risk for being a Christian. And being in Egypt, in recent history, there have been examples where Christians' lives were at stake because they were Christians. How do we respond to a context like that? How do Christians live when they are a minority? A persecuted minority, perhaps. But just as challenging, how do Christians live when they become the majority? In the period of early Christianity, you have Christians who are the minority group. And we'll talk about the way that Romans viewed Christians. Romans viewed the Christians with great suspicion. They also had a lot of, frankly, crazy stories about Christians that they believed, which were not true at all. But they were afraid of the Christians, and so they treated them as a certain way. But then in the 4th century, Christians begin, the tide of history turns, and Christians have a privileged position. Well, what happens when Christianity is now being supported by the government? What happens then? It's difficult to live perhaps as a persecuted minority, but as Christians, how do we maintain our integrity if we are the ones who have the power in the world, if we are the ones who have the political power in the world? These are issues the church has dealt with, and the church continues to deal with today. We are part of a community of saints. Now, I'll speak very personally about this. Coming from the United States, I come from a culture with a very short cultural memory. We think a building is old if it's 50 years old. Right? Other parts of the world, people think of history in a much longer period of time. So for many American Christians and many American Christian denominations, there's a lack of awareness of where we fit within church history. So one of the things that I talk about every time I can is we are a community of saints. And that community includes people, certainly people outside our little church, outside our denomination. It includes people who are worshiping God in the United States, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, all parts of the world where people are worshiping God and love Christ. We're part of the community in that sense. but also we are part of a community that stretches across time. Not just Christians who are alive today, but Christians who have come before. I am a Christian because my father was a Christian, but my father was a Christian if we could somehow trace it back, because someone in the 17th century was a Christian at a critical moment, and someone in the 13th century was a Christian, and back and back and back we go. And ultimately, all of us who are Christians because 11 men, Judas was out of the picture, 11 men who were the apostles went forth and spread the gospel. And church history tells us that all 11 of them paid for that with their lives. So we're part of a community of saints across history. Now, there are two possible dangers with this. One is we should not idealize the past, however. So I grew up in a tradition that said we want to be like the early church, because in the early church everything was perfect. Everything was perfect in the early church. Everyone felt the same way about everything. That was so perfect. Let's try to be like that now. And if there's anything wrong with our church now, it's because we're wrong. We need to be perfect like the early church. If we have studied, anyone who studied the early church knows the early church was not perfect. All of Paul's letters are written because Christians were arguing with each other about important things, or things that they thought were important. They all believed in Jesus, but what did it mean to believe in Jesus? How did you live out your life? So we should not idealize the past and say, if only we could be in that perfect time, everything would be great. But on the other hand, the other risk is to demonize the present. What do I mean by demonizing the present? I hear Christians say to me, I don't know how the church is ever going to survive this. I don't know how the church is ever going to survive now that the government has said this. In the United States, there was recently a law passed legalizing certain thing, and Christians, how is the church ever going to survive? How is the church going to survive because this happened, because that happened? Church history tells us that over and over and over again, people from the inside and outside have proactively tried to kill the church. Sometimes in a very sustained way, sometimes sporadically. But all these issues that the church has faced have not killed the church, because the church is God's work. And as much as we humans are imperfect in the way that we try to carry out God's work is going to go forward. As a church historian, when I look at the things that the church has faced throughout the centuries, and I look at what the church is facing now, yes, there are challenges now. Our challenges are no greater than challenges they faced in the past. God sustained the church in the past through everything they went through. And I am confident that God is going to sustain the church now through the various challenges and trials that the church faces today. So thinking about our community of saints, we're no worse off than the past, and we're no better off than the past. We're just in our context that has its own challenges. So one of the questions that perhaps we can discuss, and I would encourage any of you watching this video to discuss, is in what ways are we aware of our connection to church history? How do we personally understand our place in church history? And how do we see our connection to those who came before us? In my mind, this is a very important question for us to think about and to understand. Once we begin to understand our connection to church history, I think it motivates us to study church history more, to want to know more about those who've come before. And by doing so, I think we are richer as Christians and as people. Okay, questions you have, or any discussion we might want to have on the final question that I have asked here?
Well, I find that an interesting one, as my awareness of that unity is mostly around Eucharist, where you are connected with all believers. And per definition, not only believers of today, but of all history. Those who are alive and those who are already in heaven. I find that a great encouragement to be united with them, even knowing how they live.
Yeah, so the comment had to do with the the community of saints focusing on the Eucharist and how taking the Eucharist connects us with these believers, not only now, but in the past. And I appreciate that comment. I try to remind people that when we take the Eucharist, yes, we are remembering Jesus. Yes, we are. But he also says, do this until I come again. That what the Eucharist is also, it's a preview of what's going to happen. Where in that final day in heaven, we'll all be taking part of the heavenly banquet. And so the Eucharist is a great way to tie us to the past, to our present, and to eternity in a very tangible and practical way. There are certain denominations, particular Protestant denominations, that take the Eucharist very infrequently. Some of them, it's once a month, or once every 4 times a year, or once a year. In my perspective as a church historian and as a theologian, they're really missing something. They're really missing something. Or churches that put the bread and the wine on the back table and they say, go take it whenever you're ready, go take it. And I think that's not what this is about. This is about being together. It's about eating together a meal of fellowship that connects us. If we can't be connected to the people who go to our own local congregation, it's very hard for us to think about being connected to Christians across time and to the future.
In the Byzantine tradition, they are putting a main bread representing Jesus Christ, and around it several other bread representing the same Virgin Mary, other saints and so on. So it's one community.
Yes. Yeah, so the common is in the Byzantine tradition, how you have a central bread representing Jesus and then other types of bread around the outside representing other parts of the Virgin Mary, for example, other parts of the community. Yes.